Welcome to the Library of Awakening, hosted by CyberX, a space where curiosity meets courage and ideas come alive. Here we explore the thoughts that challenge, inspire, and sometimes even unsettle us, because growth often begins with discomfort. So, welcome to the journey. May this space inspire you to ask questions, explore the unknown, and most importantly, to awaken. This is the Library of Awakening. Alrighty, what is going on, Library of Awakening family? What is going on? Welcome back to another episode. In tonight's episode, we're going to be diving into the Ark Before Noah, Decoding the Story of the Flood by Irving Finkel. And we're going to be taking a look into chapter 4. Now, I read chapter 4 today earlier on while I was doing my cardio. And chapter 4 to me kind of explores why the story of a world destroying flood and a lone survivor, i.e., Noah, with a boat appears in cultures across the entire planet, from Mesopotamia to the Americas, from the likes of Asia to Europe. Flood legends echo the same haunting themes. It's kind of what I've conveyed. And that is that humans are fragile, there's divine judgment, and survival against impossible odds, and the fear that the world itself can be wiped away in a single act of nature. And so this chapter sets the stage for understanding why Noah's story became the most powerful and enduring version of them all, shaping the likes of Judaism, Christianity, Islam, and becoming one of the most influential narratives in human history. So if you guys enjoy this read tonight, do me a favor, smash that thumbs up button and subscribe. We do appreciate the love and the support. As of recent, we have had a buttload of new books shared inside the CyberX Discord that I'm super excited to get in on with you guys. These two just shared today: Ancient Knowledge. This one looks juicy. Hidden History, Lost Civilizations, Secret Worlds. One that really stood out. I don't know why this one just caught my attention. Just this one looks super mystic, right? And it is titled The Oriental Masonry, right? As we continue to go down, we got a new one on Atlantis, a couple new books on Atlantis, the Ancient World, the Cambridge Ancient History, Prolegomena or Prolegomena, and Prehistory. Prolegomena. That just looks so crazy to me. Ancient Religions. So many good new books shared with inside the private CyberX Discord. Remember that if at any point in time you guys want to access this vast collection of book PDFs, you guys can always head over to cyberxtrading.com. You guys can tap in with us in 2026. Look at this one. Who Built the Moon? That one looks good. I can't wait to dive into more of these books with you guys. There's literally thousands of books inside the private community in CyberX. So without further ado, let's dive into chapter 4, the Ark Before Noah, decoding the story of the flood in tonight's episode. And chapter 4 is, let's scroll down. Chapter 4 is titled Recounting the Flood. We might get into chapter 5, the Ark Tablets. There's some other chapters that I was reading during my cardio tonight that stood out to me, and I took a couple of different highlights from. But number 4 was really the best one in my opinion. So we'll go down to that, and we shall get started. All right. So chapter 4. Recounting the Flood. The story of a flood that destroyed the world, in which human and animal life was saved from extinction by a hero with a boat, is almost universal in the world's treasury of traditional literature. The global flood story, whose central preoccupation is the frailty of the human condition and the uncertainty of the divine plans, would certainly feature as a thought provoking entry in any Martian encyclopedia of the human world. Its rich theme has inspired many thinkers, writers, and painters, the topic moving far beyond the borders of scripture and the sacred to become an inspiration for modern opera and film, in addition to literature. Many scholars have tried to collect all the specimens in a butterfly net to pin them out and docket them for family, genius, and species. Flood stories, in the broadcast sense, which are sometimes booked under catastrophe stories, for not all possible disasters are floods, have been documented in Mesopotamia, Egypt, Greece, Syria, Europe, India, East Asia, New Guinea, Central America, North America, Melanesia, Micronesia, Australia, and South America. The scholars who have contributed most to this endeavor have produced varying totals, somewhere around 300 all told, and a range of publications will enable the devotee to sample them in abundance. Some of these narratives reduce everything to a couple of sentences. Others blossom into a powerful and dramatic literature, and looking them over reinforces the impression that any culture that cannot muster some form of flood story is in the minority. The collection and comparison of traditions is always fascinating, and creating and pruning a family tree of flood narratives is probably as enticing as any other such project. It is the breadth and overall variety, however, that is more significant than any fundamental similarity. After all, the forces of nature, including rivers, rain, and sea, alongside earthquakes, whirlwinds, fire, and volcanoes, are irresistible by man when they are roused and are likely to underpin much traditional narratives. While in any flood, however disastrous, certain individuals always survive, usually those with boats. There is no need to strive for a complex web of origin, dissemination, and interrelations on the broadcast scale. One must always reckon to with the natural flow of uncontaminated narratives being interrupted or influenced in a specific way at a specific moment, such as through the Bible teachings by missionaries. The central example from the collector's standpoint represents a unique case, however, where influence and dissemination are undeniable and have been of the greatest global significance. The story of Noah, iconic in the book of Genesis, and as a consequence, a central motive in Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, invites the comparative mythologers' greatest attention. In all three scriptures, the flood comes as a punishment for wrongdoing by man, part of a giving up on this lot and start over resolution governing divine relations with the human world. There is a direct, undoubted flood continuum from the Hebrew Old Testament to the Greek Testament on the one hand and the Arabic Quran on the other. Since the Victorian period discoveries of George Smith, it has been understood that the Hebrew account derives in its turn from that in Babylonian cuneiform, much older, substantially longer, and surely the original that launched the story on its timeless journey. This book focuses on the first stage of this process, looking at the various Mesopotamian stories that survive on cuneiform tablets and investigating how it came about that the story came into our own world so effectively. Such an approach entitles the researcher to avoid entirely the question as to whether there ever really was a flood. People have, however, long been concerned with that very question and been on the lookout for evidence to support the story. And I imagine all Mesopotamian archaeologists have kept the flood at the back of their mind, just in case. In the years 1928 and 1929, important discoveries were made on sites in Iraq that were taken to be evidence of the biblical flood itself. At for example, which is now present day Iraq, deep excavations beneath the Royal Cemetery disclosed more than 10 feet of empty mud, below which earlier settlement material came to light. A similar near contemporaneous discovery was made by Langdon and Wedelan, the site of Kish in southern Iraq. To both teams, it seemed inescapable that there was evidence of more than ancient flooding, but of the biblical flood itself. And Sir Leonard Woolley's fluent lectures round about the country, backed by his versatile pen, certainly came to promote the idea that had found proof that Noah's flood had really taken place. Similar deposits were identified at other archaeological sites, but in due course, doubts were raised whether all such empty layers were really archaeological contemporary or, indeed, were really archaeologically contemporary, or indeed, whether they were all water deposited. In recent times, this sort would be tangible evidence has fallen out of consideration. Certainly, strata of empty mud confirm that human habitation in ancient Iraq was subject to disastrous and destructive flooding, and in general background terms, such discoveries do much to enhance our appreciation of the extent to which ancient Mesopotamia was, in fact, vulnerable in this way. but few today would claim such discoveries concern the flood described in the book of Genesis. Sir Leonard, apparently, could hardly be surpassed as a persuasive speaker once he got on the subject of Ur. Lambert told me in a rare confessional moment that it was a schoolboy on the edge of a seat in a Birmingham cinema listening to Woolley lecture about discoveries that he determined on his own life's work as anthropologists. In recent times, the hunt for archaeological flood levels for their own sake has rather fallen out of fashion, while further such discoveries depend on evidence that can only come from very deep and extensive excavations, which are hardly practical today. In more recent times, scholars have turned to geological rather than archaeological investigations, pursuing data about earthquakes, tidal waves, or melting glaciers in the hunt for the flood at a dizzying pace. But it is far beyond the scope of this book to follow in their footsteps. Psychologically, it is not surprising that a flood myth should be deeply embedded in the Mesopotamian psyche, for it derived from and reflected in the very landscape in which they found themselves. Their dependence on the Tigris and Euphrates waters was absolute and inescapable, but the awe inspiring emptiness of the deep sky above them, the suddenness of the storm and tangible powers of the ancient gods like the sun, the moon, and the god of the storm meant that even the most sophisticated individuals were never far from the reality of nature's forces. The flood and ungoverned power that could sweep civilization before it like a modern tsunami was for sure no safe and comfortable boogeyman with which to frighten children, but something that enshrined remote memory of a real disaster or disasters. Probably some version of the story had been told for millennia. Culturally, the flood functioned as a horizon in time, according to which crucial events preceded it or followed it. Great sages lived before the deluge, and in all the cuneiform literature, the use of the phrase before the flood, which acquires the ring of cliche, reminds one ever so lightly of the expression before the Grey War. The universal flood was intended as an efficient kind of new broom approach that would allow the gods to start recreating more appropriate forms of life afterwards in a clean and empty world. The god Enki, clever, humorous, and rebellious, is appalled at the proposal and seemingly alone in anticipating the consequences, so he picks out one suitable human being to rescue human another life. The flood story was thus the very stuff of oral literature. Its central theme affected everybody and all listeners. All men and women knew that if God so wished it, they were doomed, and that stoppage of the very life giving water of the Euphrates and Tigris rivers would be their undoing if that happened, or if it swelled into a monstrous, all encompassing water of chaos. The flood story is full of fear, drama, human struggle, and at the last minute, Hollywood like escape. Now, real fast, if you guys ever want to dive a little bit deeper into ancient Mesopotamian and Sumerian stories of the flood depictions from Enki and Enlil and Ninkarsaj and the Anunnaki, right? You guys can go grab a copy of the Atrahasis deciphered, right? Or translated. So these ancient cuneiform tablets, they talk about, right, this biblical flood that took place, but these tablets are older than the Bible, right? The story of Noah in the Bible. And they talk about this great flood and they involve Enlil, Enki, and some of the Anunnaki, right? So definitely go check this out. This is again the translated version of the Atrahasis. To continue this, it says many Mesopotamian stories in Sumerian or Akkadian bear indications that they derive from an older time before such compositions were written down. Repetition of key passages, for example, makes a long story easier to remember and promotes familiarity in listeners who might well come to join in at certain parts, as small children do when a favorite book is read and reread. Quite soon after reading had reached the point of recording language in full, at the beginning of the third millennium BC, we see that narratives concerning the gods came to be written down. Very early clay tablets from southern Iraq contain narrative literature in which the gods feature, although to a large extent these first examples still defy translation. The flood story, in contrast, does not seem to have made it into print at such an early date. The earliest tablets with any part of the story appear in the second millennium BC, 1,000 years or more after the first experiments with writing on clay. We can only imagine how Sumerian and Babylonian storytellers might have spun tales of the Great Flood, and meanwhile, for it must long have been a staple of their craft. By the early second millennium, however, when it does start to appear in written form, we do not have just one Mesopotamian flood story, but are separate compositions in which the flood is a central component. This in itself is an indication of the antiquity of the subject, for the power and drama of the flood narrative was unending, preoccupying poets and storytellers as long as the cultures of Mesopotamia endured, if not beyond. The Mesopotamian flood story surfaces in three distinct cuneiform incarnations, one in Sumerian and two in Akkadian. These are the Sumerian flood stories and major narrative episodes within the Atrahasis epic, the one that I just mentioned, and the Epic of Gilgamesh, respectively. Each incarnation has its own flood hero. This means that it is only partially appropriate to speak of a Mesopotamian flood story as such, for there are important differences between them. Although the essence of the story is common to all three, within these three traditions, different versions of the flood story text were in circulation, some substantially different, where format, number of written columns, or even plot elements could vary, as well as language. What we call the Atrahasis epic was undoubtedly popular, appearing in many formats, never to be fully canonized, whereas the Epic of Gilgamesh did eventually become fixed into an agreed literature format. In first millennial Gilgamesh tablets with the flood story from the royal library at Nineveh are true duplicates of one another that literally tell one and the same story. There are no Atrahasis versions of the Mesopotamian flood story so far from the first millennium BC. We need some. Flood story tablets distribute themselves over the following broad time periods: an Old Babylonian from 1900 to 1600 BC, a Middle Babylonian from 16 to 1200 BC, and the late Assyrian from 8 to 600 BC, and then the late Babylonian from 600 to 500 BC. Here are the 9 known tablets which contribute to our picture of the Mesopotamian story of the flood and aid us in understanding and appreciating the newly found Ark tablet. The Sumerian account of the flood is found on a justly famous cuneiform tablet in the University Museum in Philadelphia. Once it had 3 columns of writings on each side, but approximately two-thirds is missing altogether, so our grasp of the whole remains shaky. It was written down about 1600 BC. At the Sumerian city of Nippur, an important religious and cultural center where many literature tablets have been excavated. Although the story comes to us in the Sumerian language, there are features about the wording, such as odd verb forms, that led its translators, Miguel Civil, to conclude that the theme of the flood, which destroys mankind, probably does not belong within the main body of the Sumerian literary traditions. While it does look as if the Sumerian flood story account derives from a Babylonian account, its source must have been a version that we have never seen, and it is worth pointing out that separate Sumerian versions of the story, known to us, might have been in circulation too. In this tablet, the great gods, long after the founding of the cities, decided on the destruction of the human race. Although we don't know why, despite the pleas of the creator goddess Nintur, it fell to King Zuisidra to build the boat and rescue life, which he did successfully, deservedly becoming immortal. Then, because King Zisudra had safeguarded the animals and the seed of mankind, they settled him in a land overseas, in the land of Dilmun, where the sun rises, in the Sumerian flood story, 258 to 260. For a long time, the Sumerian flood story tablet was unique, but a second fragment has been found in the Shoshin collection in Norway. This tells us that King Zuistra, whom it prefers to call Sudra, was a Gauda priest of the god Enki. The hero, Zuistra, was thus king and priest together, a joint appointment that was probably often the case in early times. The instructions of Sharapuk already mentioned in chapter 3, considered Zuistra's father to be a character called Shurapuk or Shurapak, providing a convincing looking lineage. Shurapak, son of Ubar Tuta, gave advice to Zuistra, his son. Shurapak was in fact a Sumerian city. The indispensable Sumerian kings list, which record which records kings and reign lengths before and after the flood, tells us that Ubar Tuta was king in the city of Shurapak for 18,600 years and the last to rule before the flood, but mentions neither Shurapak, otherwise known to be a wise man and sometimes called the man from Shurapak, nor Zuistra. In another document called the Dynastic Chronicle, however, Ubar Tuta is succeeded at Shurapak before the flood by his son Zuistra, thus confirming that he was the hero who underwent the Great Deluge. This is a sizable can of worms, but I think we can excuse our valiant chroniclers for getting confused about dates and lineage for kings who lived before the flood, even though, according to Greek testimonies, important cuneiform texts have been buried before the flood for safekeeping. The name Zuistra is very suitable for an immortal flood hero, since in Sumerian it means something like he of long life. The name of the corresponding flood hero in the Gilgamesh epic is Utnapishti, of roughly similar meaning. In fact, we are not sure whether the Babylonian name is a translation of the Sumerian or vice versa. The Akkadian Atrahasis epic. The Atrahasis epic is a three-tablet literary production of which no one should speak slightingly, for it is among the most significant works of Mesopotamian literature and wrestles within timeless human issues. The story of the flood and the ark, for which it is best known, is only part of a much wider narrative. The whole would make, I dare say, a corking opera. The curtain rises on a very strange world. Man has not yet been created, and the junior gods are obliged to do all the necessary work. They mutter and rebel, and finally, burning their tools. Their complaint is not without justification. The senior gods will see it to that man, Lulu, is created instead to do the work. The birth goddess, Mami, also known as Nintu and Belet Ili, is called in. But she declares that she cannot create this being alone. So the god Enki announces to all that their fellow god, Wiulu, will be slaughtered and man created. See the quotations in Appendix 1. Mankind has now been doing the work for the gods, but at the same time reproducing itself enthusiastically without being subject to death. In their profusion, mankind is extremely noisy, as Enlil puts it to his fellow gods. The noise of mankind has become too intense for me. With their uproar, I am deprived from sleep. The dreadful racket warrants a plague to wipe out mankind altogether. Ea, the Sumerian Enki, one of the senior gods responsible for the creation of man, thwarts his plan. Enlil's frustration increases, and this time he resolves to wipe out human beings by starvation, so he withholds the rain. Again, it is Ea who intervenes and reinstates the rain and restores life. Enlil's third plan is to send an annihilating flood once and for all, and it is to circumnavigate this disaster that Ea instructs Atrahasis to build his ark and save human and animal life. The gods ultimately are pleased at Ea's intervention. The Atrahasis family members are made immortal, and human life is allowed to go on. Although death is now added to the mixture, and barrenness, celibate, priestess, and childbirth mortality are instituted for the first time to keep a cap on numbers. To our minds, noise, abatement, and justification for the total annihilation of life looks a bit over the top. There can be no doubt, however, that this was the reason. Seething human clamor had reached an intolerable point. Enlil's irritation in the Atrahasis always makes me think of old people in deck chairs after lunch on the beach annoyed by other people's children and radios. It is a far cry from the moral standpoint of the Old Testament. Some Ashi Rheologists have argued, inconvincingly, that the key Babylonian word rigmu, or noise, might here be a euphemism for bad behavior, but the real issue at stake is the overpopulation. The noise is due to excessive numbers of persons, and the flood is a remedy for an antediluvian world situation in which none of the population ever actually had to die. Enlil meant what he said, though there are cuneiform spells to quieten a single fraction of baby's noise, rigmu, noise, disturbs important gods in heaven to the point of ungovernable annoyance all over again. The flood story is, therefore, woven into Atrahasis as one episode in a structured sequence. The hero of the day is Atrahasis himself, whose name means exceedingly wise. The most famous copy of the whole Atrahasis epic in Akkadian was written by a scribe called Apik Aya, who lived and worked in the southern Mesopotamian city of Sippar in the 17th century BC. The Assyriologist Franz von Koppen has not only settled the long running problem of how to read this great man's name, but has investigated his biography too. As a young man, he wrote out the whole of the Atrahasis story on three large cuneiform tablets between 1636 and 1635 BC, carefully recording the date and his own name. Apikaya will be put out to learn that the results of his labors are scattered today between the museums of London, New Haven, New York, and Geneva. Altogether, the three tablets originally contained 1,245 lines of texts, of which we have all or part of about 60%. The crucial episode about the ark and the flood occurs in Apikaya's Tablet 3, referred to regularly in this book as Old Babylonian Atrahasis. This tablet is now in two pieces. The larger, known as C1, might just possibly join C2 if they could ever be maneuvered into the same room, but the former is in the British Museum and the later is in the Musée d'Art et d'Histoire in Geneva. One day I will try out the join. There are 6 further tablets or pieces of the Akkadian Atrahasis epic that survive from the Old Babylonian period, which, though obviously the same story, reveal 4 distinct versions. Only one of these tablets happens to contain the flood narrative. This recently published tablet, also in the Shaoxian collection, is textually strongly independent of those previously known. And earlier in date than Old Babylonian Atrahasis, about 100 years. This is the passage in this tablet that is relevant. Now let them not listen to the word that you say. The gods commanded an annihilation, a wicked thing that Enlil will do to the people. In the assembly they commanded the deluge, saying, by the day of the new moon we shall do the task. Atrahasis, as he was kneeling there in the presence of Ea, his tears were flowing. Ea opened his mouth and said to his servant, for one thing you are weeping for the people, for another you are kneeling, as one who fears me. There is a task to be done, but you know not how to accomplish it. And that, tantalizingly, is the final line of the Old Babylonian Shoyan. Judging by the well-known continuation of the story, the subsequent tablet written by the scribe, if we had it, would have begun with the same lines that opened the Ark tablet. This important tablet fragment was excavated at the site of Ugarat, Ras Shamra, in modern Syria, and is still the only piece of the flood story to have come to light at a site outside of Iraqi Mesopotamia itself. Its presence there is a good example of how literature and learning was exported from the center of the cuneiform world to important cities of the Middle East where Babylonian was not the predominant local language. It has been suggested that the Middle Babylonian Ugarat, in contrast to the other Atrahasis accounts, is written in the first person, but the lines that seem to suggest that these are in direct speech and the narration is in the third person. The text, as far as we have it, is also quite distinct from other versions. This tablet fragment, like Old Babylonian Sumerian, was also excavated at the city of Nippur in southern Iraq and is now kept in the University Museum in Philadelphia. The first millennium text in Assyrian script gives us a glimpse of a different and abbreviated recounting of the story. It also has the peculiarity of having been copied from the tablet that was damaged in one or two places, marked as such by the scribe. This is the historic flood fragment excavated at Nineveh by George Smith and understandably taken by him to be a part of the Gilgamesh story. The abbreviation by which it is classified in the British Museum at D242 commemorates the generosity of his sponsor. The second Akkadian incarnation of the flood story is at once the most famous and the least ancient. It occurs in the Epic of Gilgamesh, so far the only Babylonian composition to make it as a Penguin classic and unquestionably the crown jewel of the Akkadian literature. In this very polished work, the story of the flood and the ark is incorporated at a single episode in Tablet 11 within a much longer literary achievement, which in its completed form ran 12 separate tablets. From our perspective, the flood narrative originally formed part of the completely independent story that was central not to the life and times of Gilgamesh and King Uruk, but rather to the behavior and near destruction of the human race at large, not to mention the animals. Within the Gilgamesh epic as a whole, the recycled story has felt, to many readers today, to be something of an afterthought. While it is certain that the late Assyrian Gilgamesh Ark cum flood narrative derives from earlier accounts written in the second millennium BC, there is no known example of an old Babylonian Gilgamesh story that deals with these iconic events. All our flood story sources from that time belong to Atrahasis. We will consider in chapter 7 and 8 the extent to which our earlier second millennium Ark tablet, likewise an example of Atrahasis, stands behind later first millennium accounts in Gilgamesh 11. In Assyrian Gilgamesh story, the hero of the flood is called Ut-nan-pishti. This name means I found life or he found life, and was directly inspired by, if not meant to be a translation of, the Sumerian name Zuistra. When he appears in the Gilgamesh story, he is called either Untai Pishtai. Hopefully, I know I'm butchering this, guys. Okay, son of Ubar Tutu, or the Shurapakian son of Ubur Tutu. In none of the surviving copies of the Atrahasis, as far as I can see, is the hero ever referred to as a king. Utnam Pishtu, or Pishti, too, is never referred to as a king, and there is no real reason to think he was one, except for one point in the flood tablet where a palace is suddenly mentioned, discussed on later. But this, in my view, has been stuck into the text, reflecting contamination from the historical chronicle tradition where Zuistra, with whom Utnapishti is identified, really was a king. The relationship between Enki and the Atrahasis, or Ea, and Utnapishti is conventionally portrayed as that between master and servant. If neither Atrahasis nor Untai Pishti was a king, but so to speak a private citizen, this does raise the question of grounds on which these proto-noos were selected from among their peers to fulfill their great task. It is not evident that either was an obvious choice as, say, a famous boat builder. There is some indication of a temple connection, but nothing to indicate that the hero was actually a member of the priesthood. Perhaps the selection was on the grounds that what was needed was a fine, upright individual who would listen to divine orders and carry them out to the full, whatever his private misgivings, but we're not told. As an investigation goes forward in this book, now we will pursue what happened to the flood story, as it is translated itself beyond the cuneiform world into the Hebrew of the book of Genesis and the Arabic of the Quran. In addition, there is the testimony of the excellent Borosius to round out the picture. Just when the old cuneiform world was on the wane and rule over ancient Mesopotamia was in the hands of Aramaic and Greek speakers, and Babylonian priests known to us as Borosius compiled a work about everything Babylonian known, to which he called Babyloniaka, Babylonian things. His name is the Greek version of a proper Babylonian proper name, very likely to be reconstructed as Bela Rusha, the Lord, or Bel, is his shepherd. Barusus lived in the ancient Iraq of the 3rd century BC, spoke Babylonian as well as Aramaic and Greek, and could no doubt read cuneiform fluently. Since he was employed in the Marduk temple at Babylon, he had access to all the cuneiform tablets he would possibly want, on top of which they were probably all perfectly complete too. with their aid and compiled his great work, which he dedicated to the king Antiochus, the first Soter in 280 to 261 BC. Berosus recounts the flood story in very recognizable terms in his book too, after a list of 10 kings and their sages. Unfortunately, his writings, possibly also including those of a pseudo Berosus, have only survived in quotations by later authors, and the chain of transmission is rather a tortuous one. What we have today are 22 quotations or paraphrases of his output, known as the Fragmenta, and 11 statements about the man himself, called the Testimonia. These are the work of a classical Jewish and Christian writer, few of whom are household names today. It is interesting that good Mesopotamian details are preserved in Berosus's account of the flood that do not appear in the Genesis account version, such as the dream motif, or in either earlier tradition, such as the name of the month, or the burying of the inscriptions and the idea which actually does appear in a different cuneiform text altogether. It is an exciting matter to compare the new Ark tablet dating to the old Babylonian period, probably about 1750 BC, with all these familiar and less familiar accounts. There are 60 new lines of literary Babylonian to occupy us, and poking about among the world certainly uncovers interesting things concerning the flood story as it developed within ancient Mesopotamia literature and beyond. The Ark tablet packs in crucial and dramatic sections of the broader story, which we will investigate in the following chapters. At the same time, comparing what we have already known from these versions in Sumerian, Babylonian, and Hebrew, Greek, and Arabic. Our task now is to see what evidence can be wrung out of each new line of cuneiform writing. Many new ideas come, and some old ones will have to be upset, not least the shape of the famous ark in the Epic of Gilgamesh, as we will see. So, hopefully, you guys enjoyed this tablet. As we have now seen, long before Noah, the world was already haunted by stories of a great flood across every continent. Ancient civilizations told the same terrifying tale that the world was destroyed, that life was erased, and one chosen survivor saved by a boat saved humanity. And so this was just a really good read while I was doing my cardio today. I wanted to share that with you guys because a lot of people might not know that the story of Noah predates the Bible by hundreds, if not thousands of years. And so definitely take some time on your own behalf to do some deeper research. But as always, this book can be found inside the private CyberX Discord. This is just one of many hundreds of books that can enlighten your understanding of our history, our ancient history, much further than what it is today. As always, be cognizant. Many blessings to you guys. If at any point in time you guys want to access this vast collection of books, don't forget, you guys can always head over to cyberxtrading.com. You guys can tap into the Library of Awakening section this year in 2026. With that being said, be cognizant, be aware, and I will see you guys in the next video breakdown. I know some of the perspectives that I share may be as challenging for you as they once were for me, but isn't that the beauty of exploration? Every perspective, no matter how unconventional, has something valuable to contribute to it if it's shared. Knowledge is not absolute. It's a living, breathing phenomena, shaped and reshaped over time. The important thing is not always be right, but to always be curious. Explore freely, share boldly, and learn deeply. And don't rely solely on others to validate your discoveries. Stand firm in integrity, even in the face of criticism. Remember that growth always means embracing the humility to admit when we're wrong. Learning from our errors is not a setback, it's the very essence of our progress. So, welcome to the journey. May this space inspire you to ask questions, explore the unknown, and most importantly, to awaken. This is the Library of Awakening,